Hey everybody, today's video is called The Burden Against Moab Part 2, and we continue our Passthrough study here in the book of Isaiah, which we've been going through now for about 5 weeks or so. We continue our Passthrough study here looking at the judgment announced against the foreign nation of Moab. So the burden of Moab. And Isaiah 16 verse 1 and 2 starts out, "Send the lamb to the ruler of the land, from Selah to the wilderness, to the mount of the daughter of Zion. For it shall be as a wandering bird thrown out of its nest. So shall the daughters of Moab at the fords of the Arnon." So in verse 1, we see the sending of the lamb, and it's an action showing submission to an overlord, as Mesha did to Omri, king of Israel, in 2 Kings 3:4. And Selah was a place in Edom, not far from Petra, in 2 Kings chapter 14 verse 7, from which fugitives of Moab were sent to Judah for help. And this speaks, the mount of the daughter of Zion in verse 1 is figurative for Jerusalem and her inhabitants. And then we see the Moabites in Numbers 32 verse 3 and 4. They are viewed as shepherds. And in verse 2 we see at the fords of the Arnon. The Fords at the Arnon doesn't speak about having Ford Broncos or Ford F-150s or Ford Focuses, whatever Ford the car thing has out there today. Fords of the Arnon were fugitives fled to the south to escape the Assyrians that were entering from the north. And Isaiah, he provides a powerful picture of the helpless, confused state of Moab under the hand of God's judgment as a wandering bird thrown out of its nest. And have you ever seen a bird, usually like a baby bird that fell out of its nest or somehow ended up out of its nest? And where I live, where I park my car, not where I'm at right now, but my place of residence, we have a parking garage, and on the bottom, underneath the garage, there's a bird's nest they like to build up in the beams and all that. And I remember one time hearing like a chirp, out of the nest, and there it was, a baby little, sparrow, whatever type of bird it is, was out of its nest as a baby. And when you looked at this thing, it looked confused, it looks weak, that it can't survive on its own, and it leaves it vulnerable to predators like hawks and skunks and possums, which are some very common, predators in this area. And their only course of positive action was to submit themselves, talking about Moab, to Jerusalem and its king again. You see, that baby bird needed its mother to rescue it. And so verse 3 says, "Take counsel, execute judgment, make your shadow like the night in the middle of the day. Hide the outcast, do not betray him who escapes." So Moab asked Judah for shade from the willing noonday sun from their invaders. So we see that it's the heat is bugging them in verse 3. And we see Isaiah's compassion in his prophecy as he pleads with the rulers of Judah to hide these outcasts of Moab. And again, we see the prophet's sympathies are connected between Moab and the house of David and the descendants of Ruth. And Isaiah wanted Judah to be a place of refuge and protection for Moab under judgment. And verse 4 and 5 says, "Let my outcasts dwell with you, O Moab. Be a shelter to them from the face of the spoiler. For the extortioner is at an end. Devastation ceases, and the oppressors are consumed out of the land. In mercy the throne will be established, and one who sit on it in truth, in the tabernacle of David, judging and seeking justice and hastening righteousness." So verse 4, outcasts are most likely speaking about the Moabites, and the speaker being a personification of Moab. And Moab defines who the outcasts are. And Moab continued its plea to Judah for refuge. And the prophet anticipated here the day when the oppression by the Assyrians would be no more. And as in Amos chapter 9, verse 11 and 12, the Davidic king will someday sit on the throne of Zion, his throne of Zion, and he would end all injustices such as those that were committed by the Assyrians. And God made that covenant with David, and hope lies in the Lord and his promises to David, as we also will discuss back in chapters 9 through 11. So I believe verse 4 and 5 is speaking about Christ and his reign in the millennium. And verse 6 through 8 says, "We have heard of the pride of Moab. He is very proud of his haughtiness and his pride and his wrath, but his lies shall not be so. Therefore Moab shall wail for Moab, everyone shall wail. For the foundations of Harseth you shall mourn. Surely they are stricken. For the fields of Heshbon languish, and the vine of Sibmah. The lords of the nations have broken down its choice plants, and have reached to Jazer and wandered through the wilderness. Her branches are stretched out, they are gone over the sea." So though a small nation, we see that Moab's pride was well known, later even seen in Isaiah 25 verse 10 and 11, which I think we're a few weeks away, like 3 weeks or so. And later at the end of the year, Jeremiah 48:29, Jeremiah 48:42. So though Moab was very small and insignificant, we see that they are filled with pride, and God makes it well visible here in Scripture. In verse 7, Ker Haseth is likely the same Ker as seen in our last chapter. And we see the raisin cakes are mentioned in verse 7. And they're associated with celebrations and pagan worship, as also seen in Hosea chapter 3, verse 1. And they were highly desirable. It's kind of like bringing cake to a birthday party. In verse 8, Sibmah was a suburb of Heshbon, also seen in Jeremiah 48, verse 32. And like I said, that will probably be somewhere around December, Lord willing, that we'll study that area. And Moab's vines, rather than being on stakes, ran across the ground to Moab's extreme northern border, stretching from the desert on the east of the Dead Sea on to the west. And this signified the exports of raisins and wine to Judah. And reading this might make you think about when we read about the vineyard back in chapter 5 here a few weeks back. But Jazer is the extreme north of Moabite territory. And though, as I mentioned, though small and insignificant as a nation, we should note that they were consumed with pride as the great. So keep the thought of pride in your head, that you don't have to be rich, you don't have to be mighty, popular, with, celebrity status to be prideful. Even a homeless person could be prideful. In verse 9 through 12, it says, "Therefore I will bewail the vine of the Sibmah. With the weeping of Jazer I will drench you with my tears, O Heshbon and Elilai, for battle cries have fallen. Over the summer fruits in your harvest. Gladness is taken away, and joy from the plentiful field. In the vineyards there will be no singing, nor will there be shouting, nor treaders will tread out wine in the presses." Sounds like the vineyard has just me there with no singing. But verse 11, "Therefore my heart shall resound like a harp for Moab, and my inner being for Ker Hares. And it shall come to pass, when it is seen that Moab is weary on the high place, that he will come to his sanctuary to pray, but he will not prevail." So verses 9 through 12, Isaiah displayed authentic emotion over the destruction of this rich agricultural resource. And this reflected the Lord's response too. And the normal celebration at harvest time isn't to take place. We see that there was going to be trampling of grapes, which was generally a time for great celebration, as also seen in Jeremiah 25, verse 30. In verse 11, my heart and my inner being shows the prophet and the Lord reflect deeply, felt sorrow over the necessary judgment of Moab. In verse 12, weary in the high places speaks of Moab's religion that had utterly failed. Rather than deliverance, the nation found weariness in their repeated rituals to their national god, lowercase God, at their pagan sanctuary sites. So, one thing we should really note about Isaiah is Jeremiah is known as the weeping prophet, but Isaiah is also a prophet that didn't want to have to give these prophecies because he had love for the people that the prophecies were directed toward. In verse 13-14, to finish the chapter here, it says, this is the word which the Lord has spoken concerning Moab since that time. But now the Lord has spoken, saying, within 3 years, as the years of a hired man, the glory of Moab will be despised with all that great multitude, and the remnant will be very small and feeble. So verse 13-14 to end the chapter, verse 13 is like a summary of Moab's distress in ordinary form, either as revelation in the past or a reference to the oracles in chapter 15 through verse 12 in today's chapter. In Moab, we see had 3 more years of glory, perhaps until around 715 BC, when the Assyrian king Sargon overran the country. And Assyria wasn't to completely obliterate Moab, whereas Babylon received no such promise to not be obliterated. And what we see, though, is that judgment will humble Moab. And when something, major is going to happen to us, we kind of are happy most of the time that we didn't know it was coming. Can you imagine being told this? Like, hey, 3 years from now, you're going to be pounded, you're going to be judged, and you're going to be weeping in sorrow. Can you imagine having a time frame? What's now like 2024? So let's say the date would be like May 11, 2025. Or May 11, 2027 for 3 years from now. By that time, you're going to be under judgment. Like, it's just hard words to take in. So today's wrap-up, we look at the continuation of the judgment against Moab with a call to send the Lamb. And in verse 3, Isaiah's word to Judah as she observes Moab under judgment. And verse 4 and 5 shows a plea for refuge among Moab and the day of the righteous king. And theologian Harry Bultma argues that verse 4 and 5 is an end-time prophecy of how Moab will be a place of refuge for Jews that are escaping the fury of the Antichrist after the abomination of desolation. Now I want to look at Revelation chapter 12, verse 6. Revelation 12:6, it says, then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days. And war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought with the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought. But they did not prevail, nor was a place found in them in heaven any longer. So the great dragon was cast out, that serpent of old, called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was cast to the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. Then I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, now salvation and strength in the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ is come. For the accuser of our brethren, who accused them before our God day and night, has been cast down. and they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives to the death. Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and the sea, for the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, because he knows that he has a short time. So, in this, Israel in a coming day will flee from the fury of the Antichrist and find refuge in places such as Moab for protection. And verse 6 through 8 of Isaiah 16 shows us the pain of the prophet in Moab at the judgment of God. And remember that if you get nothing out of today's study, even the small and unpopular are in danger of pride. We are all in danger of pride. And verse 9 and 12 of Isaiah 16 showed us Isaiah's sorrow of heart for Moab. And it reminds me of Jesus' sorrow over Jerusalem in Matthew 23, verse 37 through 38. Says, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I say to you, you shall see me no more till you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." So when Jesus wept for Jerusalem, when Jesus saw the desolation to come upon that city that rejected him, Jesus didn't rejoice. He wept. And Jesus knew in the midst of their calamity that they would turn themselves instead of the Lord. And we see Isaiah 16 ends with 3 years of a warning until judgment was to come upon Moab. And we should note how God judges the proud, as well as this prophecy assured God's people that the Lord would deal with other wicked nations as he, brings judgment upon his own. He dealt with Israel on his own. And that's going to wrap up today's study. We are officially approximately 25% of the way through the book of Isaiah. So we still got 75% of the way to go. We're still aiming to complete the book of Isaiah right around Labor Day. So I hope you have a great rest of your week and God bless. We'll see you back next week, a day and time to be announced.